right, we're going to look at chapter 25, and this chapter concerns Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and the new imperialism from 1800 all the way to 1914. It's a huge time span that we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to go over Africa from the slave trade to European colonial rule. Then we're going to move into the new imperialism, 1880 to 1914. Then we're going to look at the Islamic heartland under pressure. Then the expanding world economy. And finally, this chapter we're going to end on the Great Global Migration. All right, the first part we're going to look at with Africa, from the slave trade to European colonial rule, we're going to look at trade and social change. So you've probably covered this, hopefully you did, and you went into a lot of detail when you took a U.S. history course. So this is all just kind of review of what you should already know. But the most important development in West Africa before European conquest was the decline of the Atlantic slave trade and a shift in African foreign trade. Africa suffered massive environmental and human degradation. The transatlantic trade of African slaves intensified after 1700, and labor demands forced the price of slaves even higher. African merchants and rulers who controlled the slave trade in Africa made huge profits. The trade created instability and warfare, and also it decimated the African population, and it destroyed the local African economies. British campaigns to abolish slavery developed into a mass political movement, and British women actually played a crucial role in the anti-slave movement. After Napoleon was defeated, the transatlantic trade resumed its previous level. Cuba and Brazil continued to import slaves to work on coffee and sugar plantations. The U.S. Constitution actually prohibited the banning of the importation of slaves before 1808 as a concession to the southern states for joining the Union. And by 1807, President Thomas Jefferson signed a bill banning the importation of slaves from January 1st, 1808 onward. So basically, we were not allowed in the United States to import slaves from outside of the U.S. Instead, we're going to rely on natural increase of our slave population, meaning we're going to rely on enslaved women getting pregnant and producing the next generation of slaves. Trade on the west coast of Africa declined after the closing of the slave trade, but the slave exportation from the east coast is going to rapidly expand. West African trade in exotic products progressed, especially in palm oil trade. Palm oil was used to lubricate heavy machines in British factories and for soap and cosmetic products. As the transatlantic trade declined, the use of slaves within the continent of Africa increased. And we're also going to see Islamic revival and expansion within Africa. And Islamic revival brought change in Sudan through the 18th and 19th centuries. Muslim scholars and religious leaders called the effort a part of the Islamic jihad or religious war. The Sokoto Caliphate was founded by Usman Dan Fodio, and he had followers from both the Fulani and the Hausa populations. When the Muslim Gobir rulers attacked him, he waged jihad against the Hausa rulers using those discontented Fulani herders. Because of this caliphate, or caliphate, kind of depending on where you're from and how you want to pronounce that, but because of that, Islam became more widely rooted in the sub-Saharan Africa. Islam had always approved of slavery for non-Muslims, and the jihads created a new slaving frontier in Africa. Islam expanded in East Africa through the efforts of Sayyid Said, the Imam of Oman, and he gained control of the Swahili-speaking people and concentrated the shipment of slaves to the Ottoman Empire and Arabia through the markets of Zanzibar. During the late 1800s, European powers began to colonize the interior of the African continent. And Leopold II of Belgium, he signed treaties with African chiefs and established colonies along the Congo River. He misled other European leaders, saying he was intending to spread Christianity throughout the region, when really he only intended to profit from the region. The Berlin Conference of European Leaders was set up in order to create these rules for imperialist competition in Africa. The conference also focused on the effective occupation to be recognized by other states. The Berlin Conference, they did promise to end slavery and introduce Christianity to sub-Saharan Africa. Bismarck's Germany established protectorates over a number of small African kingdoms and societies. And one thing I do want to point out, this is all BS, the Berlin Conference. Their goal did not actually match the outcome. Basically what we see is, as this section is described, is this scramble for Africa. They go in and all these European countries are just trying to colonize different parts of Africa, really just to grow their empire and to reap the benefits of African minerals and people living there. So don't be fooled by what this is kind of misleading a little bit what's going on there. But in the end, what ends up happening is France is going to expand into West Africa, and they form this kind of along the Congo River. The British enlarged their holdings in West Africa and they pushed into the Cape Colony. As the British moved eastward, they were blocked by Muslims who massacred British soldiers. And then by the late 1890s, the British had overpowered most of the Muslim fighters. Leopold II, his Congo holdings became the most violent and brutal as Leopold broke his promise and introduced slavery and terror. Missionaries were banned from the Congo for fear that they would report the happenings throughout Europe. So he had promised to bring in Christianity, and then he bans those Christian missionaries from going in because he doesn't want the rest of the world to know what's really happening in the Congo. Leopold ends up slaughtering the elephant herds to gain profits trading ivory, and the trade focus turned to rubber production when the ivory began to run out. Just to give you an idea of what's going on and what different groups are moving into this area, you'll notice the different colors here, right? The British are in light green, the French are there in red. Really the only independent African nations that we have left at the end of this is Ethiopia and Liberia. You'll notice, again, this is a scramble for Africa trying to just take hold and colonize the African continent. Let's talk about Southern Africa in the 19th century. So the Dutch East India Company, they had established a supply station at Cape Town for Dutch ships heading to the Far East. So, you know, going down along the African continent and then coming back up on the eastern side of Africa, going into India and Asia, that market. And so the British took possession of the station during the Napoleonic Wars. The Dutch settlers were first identified as the Boers, but their descendants were called Afrikaners. As the British arrived in Cape Town, a three-sided war broke out and pitted the British, Afrikaners, and tribal chiefs against each other. The British, in order to protect their colony and the African labor, they established colorblind legislation, making whites and blacks equal before the law. Afrikaners resented the British efforts to treat Africans as equals and began to move north. The British controlled the important port regions, and the Afrikaners moved into the interior pasture regions. The African tribes, such as the Zulu, were moved out of that region. The discovery of diamonds in South Africa brought in the De Beers Mining Company to extract the gems and get them to market. The Europeans took the high-paying jobs, and the Africans were sent into the dangerous mines for a lower pay. As more British arrived to work in the diamond mine industry, conflicts developed with the Afrikaners in the South and the South African War of 1899 to 1902, otherwise known as the Anglo-Boer War, broke out. So kind of going back just for a second, I want to show you a couple of photographs from the time. This is what was happening in Congo. And not just, these are two children, but this is what would happen. And one of the primary sources you're going to read over talks about what's going on in the state of Congo. This is during the rubber production. So when there wasn't enough rubber or they weren't meeting their daily quotas, this is what would happen. Your arms would be, or hands would be cut off, whole arms would be cut off. Even sometimes legs would be amputated in order to set a precedence and to set an example. So I'm not sure exactly what happened with these two children. I'm sure if you go back and read in the book, it gives more detail. And it does. You can read the caption about these children, but this is just showing you the cruelty um, by Leopold and his men, and just kind of the mindset of those men. You know, and then can you imagine trying to grow up and then make a living for yourself when when part of your body has been cut off? So that's the brutality suffered in Congo. And then this is a picture of gold mining in South Africa. And you'll notice there are whites and blacks working together, but notice the different dress of the white men compared to the black men. And at this point, we do have segregation. The whites are taking on the managerial roles while the blacks are just workers. So we do see very early on segregated work being completed. So what about the colonialism impact after 1900? Well, the self-possessed claim of the French and the British to go into Africa was to provide good government for their African subjects. Many African populations simply chose not to oppose European powers or stop fighting and turn to less violent forms of resistance. The economic goal was to put the African interior on the world market. Railroads were built to transport interior products to the coast and then out to Europe. Economic development and low costs made European governments reluctant to move against the institution of slavery. They didn't want the end of slavery to disrupt the economic production or bring on costly slave revolts. And this is talking about in Africa itself. Outside of Africa, you're going to notice a move towards ending slavery in Europe and also in the United States. To pacify humanitarian protest, measures were provided for the slave to earn an income. Many slaves ran away, though, and the number of slaves is going to begin to decline in Africa. Other products were produced in the African colonies. Cocoa beans were shipped into the world's chocolate market. The black elite took advantage of the colonial opportunities, and some were allowed to run in local political elections. East Africa had very little European presence and remained more isolated from world influences other than the Arabian or Islamic worlds. Okay, we're going to shift over and talk about the new imperialism 1880 to 1914, and we're going to look at some of those causes of new imperialism. So economic motives, that was the greatest influence driving the Europeans into the African interior and onto the Asian continent. The British began to grab territories, so the other European powers did not get the upper hand. Colonial powers maintained social Darwinian theories, and it became an excuse to exploit and treat native populations poorly. The European world's industrial developments were put to the test in the African colonization process. Rapid-fire machine guns proved to be extremely lethal. Newly discovered quinine helped to control malaria. Steam power became an important asset in shipping products from desolate regions. And then we also had numerous reasons help drive the desire to settle in Africa. Shipping companies wanted subsidies, settlers wanted more land, and missionaries wanted more souls. Just to give you an idea, here is the different tools used for building empire. This was that drug I mentioned that was used to treat malaria. Also the machine gun was used, right? Go out and clear. And war, it's really easy when you have the better weapon to win. But how does it become a civilizing mission? Well, Europeans claimed their influence in Africa was an important event because it was to civilize the African population. And I want you to think about that word civilize. It means different things to different people, right? Here in the United States, we have our own definition of civilization, and historians, we have a definition of what counts as a civilization, what doesn't count as a civilization. So, you've got to take it in perspective and your background and where you're coming from. People might look at the United States and think that we are not a very civilized population. Look at all these civil unrest that we have. And we still have a lot of racism and a lot of violence. Are we really that civilized? And we might look down on other countries as well and be like, well, at least we have running water and electricity. Are you really all that civilized? So again, it's your perspective, right? But during this time period, there was also this claim that the imperial governments protected colonized people from ethnic warfare and slave trade. There's a British author, His name is Kipling, and he wrote the poem The White Man's Burden, which identified the belief that the Europeans could and should civilize primitive people. He also claimed that imperialism would eventually bring modern achievements and better living standards. So this is kind of playing off of that, the poem that Kipling wrote, The White Man's Burden. So this, I don't know if you can read it, but it says the first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. And this is an ad for Pears Soap. It's a soap company, right? And they're trying to show like, oh, if you use our soap, you'll be, you'll be more white. You'll be more like the white man who's here trying to help you. And also this was sold, throughout parts of Europe as well. We do have some critics of imperialism. English economist J.A. Hobson argued that capitalism was to blame for the rush to colonize Africa, and he contended that the push for imperialistic goals diverted attention away from the needs of the domestic population at home. Critics also accuse Europeans of a double standard and not living up to their own ideals and values. At home, Europeans were fighting for representative government, but refusing others the same opportunities. Interesting, right? African and Asians, they do have their own form of resistance, though, to this imperialism. They found it to be a disruptive assault that threatened traditional rule, and their initial reaction is what anyone's would be: drive the invaders out, drive the Europeans out. Violence developed throughout the regions, but the population simply could not confront the technology used by these Western powers. The goal of each European entity was to control as much territory as possible, and the process of maintaining domination through providing advantages to a select few is referred to as hegemony. The European empires were hegemonic in their colonial policies. Many came to the conclusion that dignity was not an ingredient of European rule. We're going to switch over. We're going to look at the Islamic heartland that comes under pressure. So there's a decline and reform going on in the Ottoman Empire. The disruption of the Napoleonic Wars and the loss of territory to Russia forced the Ottoman Empire to relinquish Serbia. The Serbians developed local autonomy, meaning they could rule themselves. The Greeks revolted against the weakened Ottoman rule, and they're going to win their independence. The Ottomans were confronted by Christian subjects in Europe, and they failed to defend their Islamic provinces in North Africa. The slave army began to decline, and those that were known as Janissaries became a corrupt unit that was based on privileged hereditary caste. The Janissaries began to work for their own pursuits instead of working for the Sultan. When Sultan Selim III tried to reorganize the army, the Janissaries refused to use Christian equipment. They revolted, and he was executed in the revolution. The Ottoman military was in disarray, creating the opportunity for Muhammad Ali of Egypt to rise and threaten the Ottomans, who survived only after pleading for European assistance. Using military force, Europeans convinced Muhammad Ali to give Syria back to the Ottomans. Europe decided it would be better to have the weak Ottomans than a strong Muslim entity in the region. The Ottomans established liberal reforms known as Tanzimat. The goal was to remake the Ottoman Empire on a Western European model. The reforms called for equality between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Commercial laws allowed free importation of foreign goods as demanded by the British. This also allowed foreign merchants access through the Ottoman territory. Muhammad Ali set out to build a nation on the strength of a powerful army, trained in the same fashion as the European militaries. Thousands of African slaves were brought to Egypt to serve in the army, but did not survive. Egyptian peasants were then used as replacements. Movements against the weakened Ottoman Empire allowed Muhammad Ali to advance into Syria, but he was convinced to retreat by the European powers. He was then rewarded with hereditary powers over Egypt and Sudan. At the time of his death, he established a strong state within the Ottoman Empire. To gain economic stability, he established agricultural production that he intended to ship to the European markets. When Ali's grandson took control, thousands of Europeans were living in Egypt. Ismail, Ali's grandson, was the new ruler of Egypt, and he envisioned a vast empire throughout northern Africa. He hoped to use European technology and capital to establish the North African Empire. Non-industrializing regions throughout the world, they're going to become known as third world. And we're going to see this rise of global inequality happening over time. And so these regions were either the last to gain independence from other European empires or the last to be colonized by the European empires. Industrialization established a higher rate of pay. The nations that were not based on modernized technology remained on a pre-industrial pay scale. Technologically advanced nations had dominated the less advanced. But this was to be expected, right? Hence the reason Peter the Great was adamant about getting Imperial Russia up to date with Western advancements. Here's a bar graph, just not a bar graph, but a graph to give you kind of this idea about industrialized versus non-industrialized. So non-industrializing regions, that included Africa, Asia, Latin America, and industrial regions included all of Europe, Canada, the United States, and Japan. But notice the scale. So this is the average income per person. Those areas where they were not industrialized, kind of steady. I mean, there's a slight increase, but not a whole lot. But then you look at these industrializing regions and look, their income per person is going to steadily grow as we industrialize. Let's switch over and talk about this industrialization, though, and the world market, because they go hand in hand. Great Britain tied the world markets together with its empire and trade routes. Technological breakthroughs that were established in the British world encouraged the continuation of trade. British manufacturers had the foresight to seek new export markets. The government also repealed laws restricting importation of grain. The free access to British markets kept the mines and plantations of Africa and Asia operating. The United States and the Western Hemisphere built long networks of railroads that shipped goods and reduced transportation costs. The steam of the railroad locomotive or the steam from the industrial boiler kept manufacturers in motion. New raw materials such as cocoa, coffee, and rubber kept world markets and buyers busy. Massive investments were made with the intention of financial returns, and this provided the capital to continue the development of technologically advanced society. Here's New York City. Just look at how crazy crowded it is, but look at all of this that they're selling like out of their carts along here, the different people represented, and also just you can tell like how crowded it is, overran. It's fascinating to me. You guys might think, oh, this is just another crowded street picture, but it really shows you how connected the world is becoming and how populated these major cities are becoming. And we're going to have to deal with that too in its own way. But talking about population, let's talk about the global migration. Millions of people left their traditional homelands in search of a better life, what we in America call the American dream. But they're looking for that dream, not just in America, but throughout kind of the world. And this phenomenon is known as the Great Migration. Many moved westward where technologically advanced civilizations offered much more opportunity than in the East. European cities became overpopulated when rural farm workers moved in search of industrial employment because that was steady employment. Farm, you've got to deal with drought, you've got to deal with famine, you've got to deal with floods, you've got to deal with Mother Nature. It's not always a constant, but industry and factory work, for the most part, that was a constant. You could find employment. Wars, famines, poverty, and discrimination led others to move into new locations and begin life again. North and South America, New Zealand, and Australia were lands open to immigration. Entire villages would follow after a member scouted out new destinations. And this phenomenon was identified as chain migration. Asians entered the west coast of North America to help build industrial and mining operations. Racism and discrimination tended to follow along, though. Discriminatory laws established by Americans and Australians were intended to keep Asians and others from settling in their countries. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. Eventually, we're going to limit how many immigrants we allow in from certain countries. We're going to establish a quota system to keep certain individuals out of the United States, and other countries follow suit. It's not just the United States that does that. Obviously, as just pointed out, Australia does it too. We're going to next look at Asia specifically, and we're going to look at Asia and the Pacific during this time period as well. We kind of look more at Europe and mainly Africa in this chapter. So we're going to kind of switch a little bit and go over on your map, go towards the east, and we're going to look at Asia specifically and talk about imperialism in Asia next.